The Hardy Boys, Hunting for Hidden Gold. Chapter 16. Information. "So it's you," said Frank. "Just my luck," muttered the outlaw in disgust. "I might have known better." Still leveling the revolver at Slim, Frank relinquished his grasp and stood back. Joe also withdrew, Slim holding his hands above his head and keeping a wary eye on the weapon. Got to a sitting position. "This is luck," Frank remarked. "We hadn't expected to meet again so soon." "If I'd had my brains, I wouldn't have let myself step into a trap like this," growled Slim. "What were you following us for? What were you doing up here?" "Trying to find you," said Joe cheerily. "Where's Shorty and Jack and Black Pepper?" Something in the man's question made Frank think quickly. Was it possible that Slim had become separated from the rest of the gang? "I suppose you know the camp's broken up," he remarked. A look of surprise leapt into Slim's face. "No," he said hoarsely. "I've been away. What happened? You don't mean to tell me—" "We're telling you nothing. They caught the gang," went on Slim. "Wait until we take you down to Lucky Bottom. You'll find out all about it then," said Frank evasively. If Slim thought the rest of the outlaws were captured, he might be more disposed to talk. "I might have known it," said Slim gloomily. "They were getting too careless. I told 'em 100 times they'd be tripped up, especially after letting you two give us the slip." "We might be able to make it easier for you," Frank suggested. "How?" "If you've got any information to give us, we might be able to put in a word for you." Slim looked at them steadily for a moment. Then he asked, "What kind of information do you want?" "You know what we're hunting for." "The gold?" "Of course." Slim was silent for a moment. "That gang has been trying to double-cross me all along," he said at last. "I don't owe 'em nothing. They'll have They would have cleared out with the gold and left me here if they could." "Did you know where it was hidden?" asked Joe. "Of course. Someone knew." "Did you know where it was hidden?" asked Joe. "Of course someone knew. They didn't dare make a getaway with it as long as Fenton Hardy was watching them. I guess the game is all up now, though. If they've got Black Pepper in jail, they'll make him come through and tell where it was hidden." "Don't the others know?" Slim shook his head. "He wouldn't tell any of us. He hid the gold himself, and we couldn't find out where. He said he was afraid we'd double-cross him and stealing it on him. I think he planned to take it himself and ditch the whole bunch of us." "What do you know about it?" "I know nothing about it," said Slim boastfully. "I know everything about it," said Slim boastfully. "Everything except where it was hidden. Who owned it in the first place? You ought to know that as well as me. Bart Dawson. And one of the Coulsons about it." "Who owned it in the first place?" "You ought to know that as well as me. Bart Dawson and one of the Coulsons had it. Dawson blew into camp a while ago with Coulson, and they dug up this gold. Dawson had it hid away someplace. It must be about 20 years ago since he'd been here. At least, that's what Black Pepper said. He was in Lucky Bottom when Dawson was here before." The Hardy boys exchanged glances of surprise. The names of Bart Dawson and Coulson were familiar. These were Jadbury Wilson's partners, and the gold must be the gold that Wilson presumed Dawson had stolen from them. And there was a mystery here that they could not fathom. If Dawson had stolen the gold, why did he bring Coulson back with him? Why had he waited for 20 years before returning to dig up the loot? "And Black Pepper's gang stole it from Dawson," persisted Frank. The outlaw nodded. Haven't you any idea where he hid it? It was in one of the old mines somewhere around here. That's how he knew you fellows were after it when he found you were searching through the workings. Where was your camp? Slim looked up at them. Don't you know? We knew it's deserted. We know it's deserted. We were on our way to try to find it. Don't kid me, sneered the outlaw. You know where it all. Don't kid me, sneered the outlaw. You know where it is all right. You here heading right for it when I began to follow you? You're not any too far away from it now. This was a stroke of luck that they had not expected. Unwittingly, they had been on the right trail to the camp all the time. What are you going to do with me? Asked Slim. We're going to take you down to Lucky Bottom, said Frank. Aw, let me go, whined the outlaw. I've told you all I know about it. Frank shook his head. I think you'll be safer in behind bars. The sheriff's a good friend of our gang. He'll fix things for me. That's up to you and the sheriff. If he tries to fix anything this time, he'll get into trouble. We'll see to that. You'd better come with us. Frank gestured with a revolver, and Slim got unwittingly to his feet. Frank gestured with the revolver, and Slim got unwillingly to his feet. Then, making the outlaw lead the way, the boys started back down the trail towards Lucky Bottom. Both Frank and Joe were anxious to resume the search for the outlaw's camp, but they were confident that they could find it not. But they were confident that they could find it now, from the fact that Slim had admitted they were on the right trail. They made the journey back to town without incident. Their arrival with Slim marching ahead and Frank keeping the outlaw covered with a revolver created a sensation. Word quickly spread about the mining camp that one of the members of Black Pepper's notorious gang had been captured, and a crowd congregated about the jail as the little procession disappeared into the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a shifty-eyed man of middle age, obviously weak and susceptible to public opinion. When he saw Slim led into the office, he scratched his head. When he saw Slim led into the office, he scratched his head dubiously. We want this fellow locked up, said Frank. What for? Asked the sheriff reluctantly. For being mixed up in the gold robbery, for one thing. If that isn't enough, you can hold him for carrying a revolver. If that isn't well enough, we'll charge him with assault, pointing a weapon, and half a dozen other things. I don't know, drawled the sheriff. It ain't quite usual. Clearly, he didn't not. I don't know, drawled the sheriff. It ain't quite usual. Clearly, he did not want to put Slim into a cell. Frank became impatient. Look here, he said. You're a sheriff here, and your duty is to lock up lawbreakers. We'll give you all the evidence you need against this chap. But we want him kept where he can't be coming to any harm. If you're afraid of Black Pepper— I'm not afraid of nobody, said the sheriff hastily. Just then the door opened, and a bearded old prospector strode in. He went right up to the desk and shook his fist beneath the sheriff's nose. Lock him up, he roared. We've stood for about enough from you, and I don't care whether you're sheriff or not. If you're going to encourage outlaws and thieves, me and the boys will mighty soon see that there's a new sheriff in this here man's town. Lock 'em up, he roared. We've stood for about enough from you, and I don't care whether you're sheriff or not. If you're going to encourage outlaws and thieves, we and the boys will mighty soon see that there's a new sheriff in this here man's town. Frank and Joe then saw that the other miners were standing in the doorway, crowding against one another, muttering truculently. The sheriff blinked. wavered, and finally gave in. I just wanted to make sure it was all right, he muttered. Don't want to lock anybody up that don't deserve it. You know mighty well that Slim Briggs deserves it, if anyone in this camp ever did, retorted the old miner. Lock him up. The sheriff took a ponderous bunch of keys from his pocket and unlocked a heavy door leading to cells. This way, Slim, he said regretfully. Slim Briggs followed him into the cell. He looked round Slim Briggs followed him into the cell. He looked round plainly expecting to see the rest of the gang in the jail as well. Suspicion dawned on him. Where's the others? He demanded. What others? Asked the sheriff mildly. Black Pepper, the rest of the boys. They ain't here. Slim gaped in astonishment. They ain't here, he shouted finally. Why, those boys told me they'd all been rounded up. I spilled everything I knew, just so I'd get less of it. I spilled everything I knew, just so I did get. I spilled everything I knew, just so I'd get let off easy. You're the only one that's been pinched, said the sheriff. So far, added Frank pointedly. Then, as Slim Briggs burst into wild outbreaks of bitter recriminations against the way in which he had been deceived, the boys withdrew, and the cell door clanged. The old miner laughed and slapped Frank on the shoulder. I guess Bart Dawson came along just in time, he declared. Sheriff would have let that bird go if I hadn't got the boys to back you up. He turned to the sheriff. We've seen that Slim is in jail. I guess Bart Dawson came along just in time, he declared. Sheriff would have let that bird go if I hadn't got the boys to back you up. He turned to the sheriff. We've seen that Slim is in jail, he said. You're responsible for keeping him there. If he gets out, he snapped his finger ominously. It means a new sheriff in Lucky Bottom. Chapter 17. The Outlaw's Notebook. Are you Bart Dawson? Asked Frank. That's me, said the old man. I'm the fellow they stole that there gold from. The Hardy boys looked curiously at the old miner. From what they had heard of Bart Dawson from Jadbury Wilson, they had been prepared to dislike him, but he appeared so genial and friendly, and his grizzled old face was apparently so honest, that they could not help but feel drawn to him. He certainly did not look like the sort of man who would desert his partners and rob them in the way Jadbury Wilson had described. Still, the evidence seemed all against him. He had betrayed his comrades and decamped with their gold, according to Wilson's story. But why, argued Frank, should he wait 20 years to return for the wealth he had hidden? Why should he return with one of the Coulsons? Could it be possible that the pair had been in league with one another against Jadbury Wilson? The mystery defied explanation, but the more Frank looked at the jovial, honest face of the old man before him, the more he was convinced that Bart Dawson had none of the earmarks of either thief or traitor. We've got one of 'em behind bars now, said Dawson, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. I only wish we had all of 'em. Perhaps we will have them all before long, remarked Frank. We've run across a few clues that may lead to something. That's good, declared the old man. Do your best, lads, and you may be sure Bart Dawson won't forget you. Frank and Joe forbore any mention of the name of Jadbury Wilson. It was best they decided to keep the information to themselves until they should learn more about the affairs of the stolen gold. They had long since learned that one of the axioms of successful detective work is to listen much and say little. Accordingly, they bade goodbye to Bart Dawson and left the jail. Where to? Asked Joe. Back to where we caught Slim Briggs. Back to where we caught Slim. We were on the right trail to the camp. But if the outlaws have left there isn't much use going up there now. We never know what we'll find." The boys made their way up into the mountains again, and after about an hour of steady traveling, found themselves on the trail that led into the defile where they had trapped Slim so neatly. On the way, they discussed their meeting with Bart Dawson. "I can't imagine that old fellow being the kind of man who would desert his partners and steal their gold, the way Jadbury Wilson described," said Frank, for the 10th time. "I just can't figure it all out. You can tell with half an eye that he isn't a crook, yet Jadbury Wilson was absolutely convinced that he had left them all in the lurch. And he had the gold in his possession. We know that. He came back here to dig it up. That shows he must have hidden it, as Wilson said he did. The whole story hangs together mighty well. Yet, why should he bring Coulson with him?" objected Joe. "That's another odd angle. I can't figure it all out. I think we should see Coulson and tell him what we know. Tell him what Jadbury Wilson told us and ask him about it. That's the best idea. But isn't it strange how Jadbury Wilson always back But isn't it strange how Jadbury Wilson, all way back in Bayport, should be connected with this case, away out here in Montana? It's a coincidence all night." "That's the best idea. But isn't it strange how Jadbury Wilson, away back in Bayport, should be connected with this case, away out here in Montana? It's a coincidence all right. We just seem to have blundered into an affair from both ends. But Dawson and Coulson know a lot. We don't know. But then we know a lot that Bart Dawson and Coulson don't know. I think we hold the advantage tomorrow. We'll try to find Coulson." The boys were going down the defile now, and they passed between the overhanging rocks where they had captured the outlaws. The mark of this struggle were still plainly evident in the snow. "Poor Slim," remarked Frank, with a lurch. "Poor Slim," remarked Frank, with a laugh. "He'll be kicking himself all around the cell for talking so much. He was nicely fooled. He was sure the rest of the gang were all in jail. We didn't tell any lie about it. He took it for granted that the outlaws were arrested. All we did was to look wise and tell him to keep on thinking so." The boys chuckled at the recollection of the ease with which the dull-witted Slim had been duped. "If only the rest of them are that easy," said Frank. "No such luck. I'm thinking this Black Pepper will give us trouble before we are through. He seems to have Lucky Bottom pretty well under his thumb. He has the sheriff buffaloed at any rate, by the looks of things. If Bart Dawson hadn't showed up when he did, I don't think Slim Briggs would be in jail at this moment." The trail now led towards a clump of trees, and there were evidence of recent habitation. Some of the trees had been chopped down, presumably for firewood, and the stumps rose above the level of the snow. There were numerous footprints about the little grove. In some places, the snows were closely packed down. As the boys drew closer, they caught a glimpse of a small cabin in the midst of the grove. "We'll go easy from now on," said Frank quietly. "Some of them may have come back." The boys went cautiously forward, keeping to the shelter of the trees as much as possible. Every few moments they would stop and listen, but they heard not a sound. There was not a voice from the cabin. The only noises were the rustling of the trees in the wind. Quietly, the hardy boys stole up towards the cabin. It stood a little clearing in the woods. At the edge of the clearing they waited, but still they heard nothing, and finally Frank was satisfied that the place was in fact deserted. "No one here," he said in a tone of relief. "We'll take a look around." They advanced boldly across the clearing. Directly towards the door of the cabin, it was half open. Frank peered inside. The place was deserted. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a rude table, 2 chairs, and bunks on either side. There was a small iron stove at the far end of the building, and the place was dimly lighted by one window. There was every evidence that the laws There was every evidence that the outlaws had left the place in a hurry. Papers, articles of clothing, rubbish of all kinds lay about the floor, scattered here and there in abandon. One of the chairs was lying overturned on the floor. The place was in confusion. The boys entered. "Looks as if they didn't waste much time in getting out," remarked Joe. "I'll say they didn't. The cabin looks as if a cyclone had hit it. Wonder if there'd be any use looking through those papers." Joe indicated a scattered heap of old envelopes, letters, tattered magazines, and torn sheets of paper lying on the floor. "That's just what I was thinking." Frank scooped up a handful of papers and sat down on the bank. "That's just what I was thinking." Frank scooped up a handful of papers and sat down on a bunk. He began to sort them over. The magazine was flung to one side as worthless. Some of the sheets of paper contained nothing but crude attempts at drawing or pencil lists of figures, presumably done by some of the outlaws, lying idly away. Some of the sheets of paper contained nothing but crude attempts at drawing or penciled lists of figures, presumably done by some of the outlaws while idling away their time in the cabin. One or two of the letters Frank put to one side as liable to give some clue to the identity of the members of the gang. When he had looked through the first handful of papers, he picked up some more. Suddenly he gave an exclamation of satisfaction. "Find something?" asked Joe. "This may be of value." Frank held up a small black notebook and began flipping the pages. On the inside of the cover he read, "Black Pepper, his book." "This is the captain's own little record book. There should be some information here." Frank began studying the book carefully. The first few pages gave him little satisfaction. The writing consisted largely of cryptic abbreviations, evidently in an improvised code, known only to the outlaw himself. There were the names of several men written on another page, and among them he recognized the name of Slim, Shorty, and Jack, the trio who had captured them at the abandoned mine working. Across from their names had been marked various sums of money, evidently their shares of the gang's takings in some robbery. Then on the next page he found a crude map. He studied it curiously. It looked something like the ground floor plan of an extremely crude house. There was one large chamber with 2 passages leading from it. One of these passages was marked with an X, and each passage led to a small chamber. From one of these led still another passage, which branched into a tiny room, and in one corner of which was inscribed a small circle. "That's the funniest plan of a house I've ever seen," said Joe, looking over his brother's shoulder. Frank studied the plan for a few moments and then looked up. "Why, it isn't a house at all. It's a mine," he declared. "This is the plan of a mine. This big room in the main working at the bottom of the shaft. This is the plan of a mine. This big room is the main working at the bottom of the shaft, and these passages are tunnels leading out of it." "Perhaps it's the mine where the gold is hidden," cried Joe in excitement. "There may be something about it on another page." Frank turned the leaf of the notebook. There he found what he was so eagerly looking. There he found what he was so eagerly seeking. At the top of the page was written in a scrawling, unformed hand, Lone Tree Mine. Beneath that he found the following: follow passage X to second cave, and then down tunnel to blue room, gold at circle. Frank looked up at his brother. This is what we wanted, he said jubilantly. They've had the gold hidden there all the time. All we have to do now is to find the Lone Tree Mine, and we'll recover the stuff in no time. Unless the outlaws have taken it away by now, pointed out Joe. That's right, too. I hadn't thought of that. They may have taken it away right after they abandoned this camp. Well, we'll just go to take that. Well, we've just got to take our chances on it. If they've left it in the mine this long, they may think it's safe enough there a while longer. Frank got up from the bunk and stuffed the notebook into his pocket. His eyes were sparkling with excitement. Joe, I believe we're on the right track. We know just where the stuff has been hidden, and I've a hunch it's there yet. We haven't any time to lose. Let's start right now before those rascals get ahead of us and hunt for the Lone Tree Mine. Why, I'll bet I know where it is, declared Joe. Don't you remember an old mine working near where we caught us the other day? Why, I'll bet I know where it is, declared Joe. Don't you remember an old mine working near where they caught us the other day? There was a big pine tree by the top of the shaft, standing all by itself. I'll bet that's the place. Come on, we'll try it anyway. Hastily, they left the little cabin. They were sure now that they were on the trail of the hidden gold. Frank remembered the lone pine tree, and Joe had mentioned. Hastily, they left the little cabin. They were sure now that they were on the trail of the hidden gold. Frank remembered the lone pine tree that Joe had mentioned. It seemed to identify the abandoned working as the place they sought. It was snowing heavily as they started down the trail, but the boys scarcely noticed it in their excitement. They even forgot that they had not had their lunch. If the outlaws haven't beaten us to it, declared Frank, we'll have that gold before the day is out. And we will continue this book next Friday or Saturday. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.